Hello and welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for February 29th, 2024. My name is Tom Luongo and we have a lot to talk about. It is episode 172 and I have back with me a favorite guest of mine from last year. Actually, I think this is one of the best trafficked episodes I've done, which is when I had Richard Poe on back last summer to discuss a lot of the history of perfidious Albion, for lack of a better turn of phrase. And so I wanted to get Richard back on the show because we haven't chatted in a few months. And I think that today is not today in particular, but just this period in history is very interesting because I've come to the conclusion, the older I get, the more I watch this play out, the more I realize that there's still a real honest to God split, I think, between Anglo-American imperatives and what the Europeans are trying to do and how that interfaces with the Russians and the Israelis and this and then all of this stuff. And it's just very, very weird. So Richard, I couldn't think of anybody else other than Richard Poe to talk about all this stuff with. So Richard, good morning. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for, coming back on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. It was great to be here again.
Okay. So it was interesting. Before you and I started, we were sitting there trying to come up with a jumping off point. And I threw something at you that I think is really interesting, which is I got tweeted something at me last night from that I thought was really interesting about the British Crown. Right. And I'm going to read the tweet out and just the series of events of things that have happened. And I think it's an interesting jumping off point because the British Crown is one of those subjects that, everybody has an opinion about. So let's just throw out. So in the past 2 months, this guy Killian on Twitter says, so in the past 2 months, King Charles has been diagnosed with cancer. Kate Middleton had abdominal surgery and has not been seen since December. Sarah, the Duchess of York, was diagnosed with skin cancer. Prince Edward is stepping back from royal duties. Thomas Kingston, who married into the British royal family, died suddenly. Now Jacob Rothschild is dead. King of Norway was rushed to the hospital, but Pope Francis was rushed to the hospital. The Queen of Denmark announces a shock abdication. And there's something about 2 horses were spotted in front of Buckingham Palace. Do you think this is indicative of anything, or is this an assault on the crown, or what's going on? What do you think is going on here? Again, this is just almost a bit of playfulness this to start this thing off.
Well, I know there's some people out there on social media who are hoping this means somehow the British royal family and maybe royalty in general are going to be removed, that there's going to be no place for them in the coming order, whether that's Klaus Schwab's fourth industrial revolution or whatever order people think is coming next. So I see a lot of kind of hopeful speculation about that. I have to tell you, Tom, I don't buy that. I mean, to me, yes, clearly some kind of signals are being sent out, and the 2 black horses with the so-called captured white horse, of course, was all over the internet a few days ago, and people were saying, "Oh, a rare sighting. It's only been seen before World War II, I think, and before Elizabeth II's death, and it's a harbinger of something." And gosh, I mean, weird things go on in England. I mean, they have all kinds of weird symbolic cultural things built into their system. And of course, one thinks of the Grim Reaper appearing at King Charles's coronation. I mean, they enjoy this sort of thing, and it has good entertainment value and good propaganda value, and I'm sure it all means something. But does it mean they're being removed, that they're going to lose all their money and their power? I don't see any reason to expect that. And maybe it's partly because of my own worldview that I happen to think that the traditional, the ancient aristocracy of Europe is still running things. That just happens to be my view. I believe they are 100% behind all these big changes that are coming with the fourth industrial revolution, the Great Reset. They are certainly 100% behind Klaus Schwab. It's not conceivable to me that they would take themselves out of their own plan, which they themselves have been working on for centuries, generations. So I just don't see that as real. I think, if anything, what we're seeing is maybe a distraction, maybe just a little red meat for the masses, for the overexcited masses on social media who are looking for something to try to understand the puzzling events of our present day. I fear it's nothing more than that, nothing more than a game that our overlords are playing with us. And forgive me if that's a bit too much of a black pill for some people. I don't mean it to be.
Hmm. Okay.
Uh,
I mean, that's yeah, I tend towards that same, conclusion about this, that, we're pattern recognition monkeys, right? We're really good at this. We have brains that have been designed from the ground up to look for patterns where they may or may not be. I analyze stock charts all the time, and that process of seeing patterns where they aren't real. And it's a process called reification. And you can look at, and it's one of the few stub articles on Wikipedia that's actually worth reading because it's actually accurate. And we're very good at this. We're very good at seeing things where, um, we're seeing patterns and seeing ideas that aren't there, and then trying to make sense and use them to try and make sense of it, because it's part of our threat assessment. It's part of our pattern recognition. This threat assessment are inherently linked in the brain and in our psychology, because, well, and if there's nothing more, you would think at this point in time, there's so much as to what you to riff off what you just said, that um we have we are all such filled with so much anxiety about what these
mhm.
people are trying to do, that our threat assessment systems within our brain are just, off the charts. And so for me, that makes sense. So, but when I saw this morning, I was like, somebody asked me about it. I'm like, ooh, this is an interesting thing as a jumping off point for what's, I think chatting with you this morning is that, because I do think that they do love to play these games, and
Yes.
in order to to distract us, and, the world of overlapping psyops, as I like to put it. So,
Well, and of course, Winston Churchill, many decades ago, gave a famous speech in which he said that the next incarnation of the British Empire would be an empire of the mind. And he spoke very interestingly about this idea that power would, the struggle for power would be waged within the human mind, more than on any other front in future wars. And of course, he was referring immediately to the Cold War struggle, the struggle for hearts and minds to supposedly win people over from communism to Trotskyism, which was the chosen ideology of the West, within the intelligence community, a topic I wrote some articles about a few years ago. There was actually a lot of people don't realize that, when they see the prevalence of Trotskyism in sort of left liberal circles today, a lot of that was generated by a Western intelligence program, which was it's usually called a CIA program, of course, but it was actually initiated by British intelligence, of course. And the whole idea was, as we entered the Cold War, the British primarily had this idea that somehow we had to offer something, we being the West, the new Western alliance, the new permanent NATO alliance, which was taking form, that we, quote unquote, had to offer the world something just as attractive as communism supposedly was, just as excitingly and nicely packaged, and with just as many social uh, perks and benefits and all that, but something that was better. So basically, what they wanted was to offer communism or socialism, but in a better form, a Western form. And so they created a movement which they called the non communist left, the NCL for short. And there have been books written about this. It's a real thing. It's been totally verified from declassified documents and what have you. And so what they did was they recruited leftists, primarily Trotskyites. The criterion for these recruits were people who were passionately of the left, but who hated Stalinism, who hated Soviet communism as it then existed in the USSR. And these were the people, and this was the type of ideology that Western intelligence, and particularly in the Anglosphere, British intelligence and its fledgling child, the brand new American CIA, this was the ideology they embraced. They embraced this program called the non-communist left, and what they sought to do throughout Western Europe and within the United States even was to inculcate cultural and intellectual circles and ultimately political circles with this doctrine of a better form of socialism, um, not capitalism or any other such anti-communist doctrine as we were led to believe, those of us who grew up in the midst of the Cold War. That wasn't their doctrine at all. What they were trying to introduce was socialism with a Western face, socialism or communism that was somehow mysteriously anti-Soviet. And they actually managed to find people like this and indoctrinate people like this. And there actually still are quite a lot of people in the government and in sensitive positions who are still um, programmed this way. That somehow the left is good, but Russian communism as emanating from Moscow is somehow the epitome of all evil. And it's basically an infight between the left, and it is the very source of this strange, unexplained leftism that we see being so heavily promoted and protected within our so-called deep state. It's not an accident, and it's not even because of infiltration. It was actually a deliberate plan that was set in place at the end of World War II and was executed. And as far as I can tell, it never ended. I mean, supposedly it ended. Books were written, documents were declassified, disavowals were disseminated to the public, and it was said that supposedly this program had been a failure and was being abandoned. But I think when we look around us, it's pretty obvious that some form of communism is now the mainstream ideology of the militant West.
Yeah. So interesting, as you were saying that, I was jotting some notes down, which is something I don't normally do, but the what popped into my head was this kind of the idea of it sounds like you're describing the third way. Like when I was growing up, I heard a lot of this. Well, there's a third way between communism and capitalism. There's this and socialism is that third way where we can have kind of free markets, but we have to put controls on it. And I start thinking in those terms, my mind immediately goes to economics, and we have economic theory, Keynesianism, which is
Mm-hmm.
another way of saying technocracy, where we manage the economy and then we manage the economic sphere through with government creating guide rails for how we're going to do things and whatnot, and that but it really is just repackaged. This is the same repackaged leftism without in order to get to where we are today, this kind of more perfect technocratic future. And we saw it in, my friend and business partner Dexter White talks about McNamara and the technocratic state within the DoD that ran the Vietnam War, and these people just believe in their spreadsheets. And then if you look at the European Union today, there that's like the full flower of this idea, as embodied by the technocracy of the European Union. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, yes, that's all part of it. I think it goes deeper than that, and Tom, my constant bias is always to believe that history repeats itself, history rhymes with itself, history echoes itself. um, we can go back, to the 60s and the McNamara and the technocrats, but we can always go back further, and we find that the same ideas are still there no matter how far back we go, just under different names. So, for example, I wrote an article called "How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews," and in that article, one of the subjects I explored was how Karl Marx was actually recruited by British intelligence. He was given a handler who was a Scottish nobleman called David Urquhart, who was actually a very famous British spy of the day. He was kind of a Lawrence Arabia of his day. He had a great love for Middle Eastern culture. He became very close to the Sultan of Turkey. He went out into the Caucasus area and whipped up Muslim revolts among tribesmen in the Caucasus against the Tsar. And he received a name, El Dawood, I think. So he was kind of an early precursor of Lawrence of Arabia, and in many ways the same kind of person. But he was also part of the high nobility of Scotland, and he adopted. He reached out his hand to Karl Marx, who was supposedly taking refuge in England after being kicked out of several European capitals for his supposed revolutionary activities. And by the way, Marx himself married a noblewoman back when he was still in Germany. He married a woman who was of the Prussian nobility, but who was also directly descended from the high nobility of Scotland. And I'm still researching this, but I've seen some hints, some indications that this David Urquhart was may have been a relative of his wife, of Marx's wife. So he was really in like Flynn with the British establishment and the British royal establishment. Um, and he was this David Urquhart, who was absolutely an intelligence operative, no ifs, ands, or buts, and also an arch reactionary who believed in bringing back feudalism. This man became Marx's leading mentor and patron uh, in Great Britain, where as you may know, Marx spent most of his life after he fled there. So Urquhart had an obsession with Russia, and this was a very British obsession. I also wrote about that in this article, how the British invented communism. The British had been obsessed with Russia ever since they discovered it, which was back in the 1500s, I guess, or 1400s. They first came by sea. They were looking for a northeast passage in the polar regions and sort of accidentally stumbled upon this remote kingdom of Russia. And Ivan the Terrible was then the Tsar, and the British reached out to him. They tried. At first they got along with him very well. He was interested in trading with them, but then they tried to strong arm him and force him to enter into a monopolistic agreement where they would trade exclusively with the British, which offended him, and he kicked them out for a while. But then they came back in. They always come back in, and they started this Muscovy company, which was still there at the time of the revolution, the 1917 revolution, centuries later. And this British Muscovy company, I believe, still exists, and it's one of these famous joint stock companies that were created during the age of exploration, and through which the British Crown, through essentially public-private partnerships, used these kind of semi-private fronts to do what we might call the dirty work of imperialism, of colonization, and so forth. So, since the very first time they encountered Russia, they had tried very ambitiously to make control of it and turn it into a vassal trading state. But as Russia grew more powerful in the next 200 years, and especially under Catherine the Great, she basically pushed the Turks out of the Black Sea area. Up until Catherine the Great, the Turks had owned the northern coast of the Black Sea and had been in a position to prevent the Russian fleet from operating there, even the merchant fleet. And Catherine ended all that. She threw out the Turks and captured major ports on the Black Sea. And all of a sudden, Russia had naval access and merchant marine access to the Eastern Mediterranean, which was then controlled by the British Navy. And at that time, Russia became a direct threat to what the British perceived as their interests. And by their interests, they meant maintaining naval control over the Eastern Mediterranean and therefore the trade routes to the east, to India, to China, to all points east. And of course, the Silk Road to China, Central Asia, all that depended on having control of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so when Russia suddenly gained access to the sea, the British immediately threatened war against her. They threatened war against Catherine the Great, if demanding that she return one of these ports to the Turks, and she refused to do it. So the Brits backed down on that occasion, but they then set their minds to defeating and really destroying this Russian Empire, which had emerged. And their plan was to utterly destroy Russia's military and economic might and to break the country up into little pieces, a plan which I maintain they still have to this day, and which probably underlies a great deal of the sometimes overheated anti-Russian rhetoric that we hear coming out of London to this very day. So Karl Marx actually got his big break in Great Britain working for this Scottish lord, David Urquhart, who put out publications that were anti-Russian. He accused the British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, of being a Russian agent, of being in the pay of the Tsar because he was insufficiently tough on Russia. And Marx himself just dived into this anti-Russian stuff unabashedly. He, in his writings for this man Urquhart, he really almost ceased to function. He, in a sense, he almost dropped the pretense of being a revolutionary leader, and he became an unabashed spokesman for British imperial interests. And he wrote not only for this David Urquhart's publications in Britain, but he wrote for Horace Greeley's newspaper. I forget what it was called in New York. The guy who said "Go West, young man."
Right.
It was the highest circulation newspaper in the English-speaking world at that time, and Marx became a regular correspondent. He was the top correspondent there for quite some time, and he was all about Russia, 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 down with Russia, the Russian threat. So he was a major, major anti-Russian propagandist. And one of the issues I address in my article is how embarrassing this period of Karl Marx's life was to Marxist scholars who came later and were trying to rewrite his story as if he were an idealist who simply wanted to establish a proletarian state and help the working man and all that. But this period when he was all about anti-Russian propaganda, completely in line with the well-known anti-Russian agenda of British statecraft of the time, this period is a great embarrassment to Marxist historians, and especially those of the Soviet era. And the references to it have actually been completely removed from certain authorized Marx, that is, biographies of Marx, which were written during the Cold War era and which relied on research assistance from the Soviet archives, where Marx's papers are all housed now. The Soviets were given complete control over his papers, and so this is a real scandal in the whole field of Marx scholarship. And to this day, people on the left don't really quite know what to say about it. But the fact is that Marx was a British agent by any definition whatsoever. He was recruited as a British agent. He was married into British aristocracy. He lived in England. And most importantly, he served British imperial interests under the direct mentorship and direction of a very high-level British spy master who was David Urquhart. So it's not even controversial. It's an absolute fact. So the question becomes, why did the British want somebody like him? Why did they want this wild-eyed German Jewish revolutionary, as he supposedly was? Why did they want him, of all people, to represent their imperial interests, especially vis-a-vis Tsarist Russia? Well, there are all kinds of reasons, but the one I explored in my article is that there were certain, I think it was in 1882, there were two young scholars who came out of, who later became important figures in the so-called Round Table movement. And I think we may have talked about this movement in our first interview.
Maybe.
But this was it was some call it a think tank, some call it a secret society. It actually called itself a secret society, but its purpose was to organize elites within the British Empire, within Britain itself, and within other English-speaking colonies and other English-speaking jurisdictions, including the United States, to try to, basically their goal was to create a global English-speaking superstate, to consolidate the empire into an ever closer union with the English-speaking countries at the center of it, at the core of power, including the United States, which is supposed to be drawn back into the British system through various inducements, one of which being that it would be given a position of great power and influence within this new reinvented British Empire. And so it's my contention, first of all, that the Round Table was completely successful in this endeavor, and that the world we live in today is, in fact, the world that was envisioned by the Round Table. And this has all been written about, of course, in the writings of Carroll Quigley, all the Georgetown University historian. And you can find a lot of information about him online. He wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment back in the 1940s, which he feared to even attempt to publish until it wasn't published till after his death in the 1980s. And then another book called Tragedy and Hope, which was published in the mid-60s, but then there were all kinds of censorship problems. They pulled it out of print. They took out pages. They lied to him. There's a good video of Quigley, a famous radio interview of him complaining about how he was mistreated and all the censorship that he experienced. But these writings that he had so much trouble getting before the public were about this Round Table movement and how it was how it was first formulated in the Victorian era in the 1870s and 80s, and especially the 1890s, supposedly with Cecil Rhodes in a leading role, although I think Rhodes was just a front, because this roundtable clearly had the support right from the very top of the British establishment, including the British Crown, and there's no question about that. It was simply a front or an expression of British imperial interests of the time. And although Quigley in his books claims that it was ultimately unsuccessful, and that it was, in fact, was a catastrophe, I say he's wrong. I think maybe he was to some extent propagandizing. Some say that he actually was an official propagandist for the Round Table, and that he was saying what they wanted him to say. He was appointed to be their official biographer of this movement, if you will, the official chronicler, and that this was the propaganda message he was supposed to put out, that somehow the whole thing was overambitious, it was ill-conceived, and that it failed. But even though Quigley says that it failed, in the process of saying that, he admits some astonishing things, among which are his claim that this roundtable essentially planned World War I at least a decade in advance and caused World War I to happen, and the same with World War II. And he brings to the table quite a lot of compelling proof of these statements. He says these roundtable people essentially created the Boer Wars in South Africa, and then using the same template as they gained control of Britain's foreign policy establishment, they created World War I and created World War II, according to him. Now, Quigley's take on all that is that they somehow overreached and they exhausted themselves and they went too far, and the whole British Empire broke up and it was their fault. I have a different take on that. I think their plan succeeded completely and brilliantly. I agree with Quigley that they started World War I and they started World War II, and that these wars accomplished exactly what they wanted to accomplish, which was to bring the United States back into a reinvented British system in a state of permanent military alliance with Great Britain. We now have not only NATO, but we have the Five Eyes Intelligence Treaty, where the intelligence agencies of the five English-speaking countries are all basically united together. An extraordinary situation that most people even now don't fully appreciate the importance of it. So these are things that Americans back in the 1900s and 1920s were ferociously against. Right. And that's why the U.S. Senate rejected the first attempt at world government, the League of Nations. But because of this constant pummeling of world war and other manufactured threats, slowly but surely, and with the spilling of a great deal of innocent blood, the American people were pounded into an acceptance of this new order. And it is the order that was put forth by the British Round Table. So this is my interpretation of this whole Round Table situation. And I think there are more and more researchers coming forth who are writing books and articles and giving support to this position, which is that the position that Carroll Quigley got it only half right, that this roundtable did not fail, that it actually succeeded, and that the world we live in today is the world that the roundtable wanted. So if we are living in a world order that was conceived by British elites and whose entire purpose was to further the agendas and the goals of the British Empire and the British aristocracy and the British establishment, and if this plan actually succeeded, I think it's well to ask whether the so-called American empire, which everybody claims exists today, is this American empire really an American empire, or are we simply a country, albeit a very powerful country, which has been lured and maneuvered into a position of alliance with Great Britain and the British system for the purpose of serving that British system and serving those British agendas.
Right.
And this is the big question that I'm asking, and many others are asking as well.
It's a question, Richard, that I've been asking, and
Yeah.
when I look at it from a history of banking and from a financial perspective, because again, at the end of the day, none of this is possible without having control over the flow of money and the flow of trade and the flow of goods. You and I spoke previously. I don't think you and I spoke off camera about this, about how the fledgling United States after the Revolutionary War, after Cornwallis surrenders to Yorktown, how the fledgling United States were still beholden to British mercantile interests, all throughout the forming of the country, the early days of the country, even going into the War of 1812 and whatnot, because our primary trade partner was still the British, and so we were still the raw goods suppliers for British manufacturing, and we were still beholden to them in that respect, and that's how they were able to continue to exert control over the early United States. And I think I'd like you to speak to that a little bit, because I think it'll help explain. We're gonna loop all the way back to what you opened with about Trotsky, because Trotsky is a very important figure in all of this, because because he informs all of the neoliberal / neocon ideology that we see today in American and British foreign policy wonks, the people who are running our foreign policy and have us on the verge of World War III. So, but let's talk about the early days of the United States from a banking and trade perspective, in order to bring us up through until something like the Civil War. I think it's very important. I think it's
Sure.
because once we figure this out, you'll understand. We'll all understand why Andrew Jackson got rid of the Second Bank of the United States in 1836.
Right. Now, the big issue, in my opinion, the real cause of the revolution, and John Adams said this as well, was the trade imbalance between the American colonies and the mother country, which was 10-1 in favor of Britain throughout the entire colonial period, right up to the Revolution. And then even after the Revolution, it only went down to 3-1 in favor of Britain, which is still pretty catastrophic. Now, but let's talk about before the Revolution. When you have a 10-1 trade imbalance with another country, that means you are hemorrhaging, you are bleeding your wealth, your labor, the fruits of your labor. You are absolutely bleeding to death. And the only thing that kept the United States, well, it wasn't the United States then, but the only thing that kept the American colonies thriving, and we did thrive during that time, was simply the fact that we had such enormous natural wealth, and we were constantly expanding and consuming more, that is harvesting more natural resources and growing food and exporting it to the mother country. But by law, by certain laws that had been passed by England, and specifically the so-called Trade and Navigation Acts, which had been passed under Cromwell originally, and then they were renewed when the monarchy came back in. These laws were extremely oppressive to the colonies because they essentially forbade or made it impossible for us to trade with any country except England. And they also forbade us to engage in any kind of manufacturing whatsoever for export, even for export from one colony to another. And so the result was we could only harvest raw materials and harvest cash crops such as tobacco and food and so forth, and sell these raw materials and raw foodstuffs to England for very cheaply. But in order to obtain manufactured goods, and especially clothing, we had to get that from England primarily, and so and that includes any other kind of manufactured goods, machines of any kind, iron goods, nails, horseshoes. We could make them on a small scale. You know, if you had a farm and you had a blacksmith, you could make some horseshoes. But for the larger market, basically everything had to come from England, and including such a small item as a nail. And as time went on, the British became increasingly strict because, if you can imagine, in what was already a huge country at that time, the 13 colonies, with many great seaports, as you can imagine, people were doing everything they could to circumvent these laws. Smuggling was a huge business because it was just ridiculous not to be able to use the great bounty of our lands and our seaports. So the British just got stricter and stricter, and they started passing more and more laws where they had officers of the crown sticking their noses into people's faces continually, knocking down people's doors, confiscating their goods, arresting people, prowling the rivers, the waterways, looking for people who, in some way or another, were violating these Trade and Navigation Acts. And so this was the great, great provocation that not only did they create these acts that caused a 10-to-1 trade imbalance because we were selling cheap raw materials and foods to England, and England was selling expensive manufactured goods to us. So not only did we have a 10-to-1 trade imbalance that was bleeding us dry, but anybody in the colonies who was trying to circumvent that by going around the laws and engaging in smuggling, whether locally or overseas, the British just kept cracking down more and more harshly to the point where it became extremely oppressive. And this is a story that is not told in our schools. Even when I went, to grade school, which was quite a while ago, I mean, there was still some semblance of traditional education. They didn't teach us this. They taught us about the intolerable acts and the tea tax and all that, all of which was true and had something to do with it. But this essential problem of the trade imbalance was, according to John Adams, this was the cause of the revolution. And it is no accident, Tom, in my opinion, that to this day, with the emergence of Trump and the populist movement, the Make America Great movement, that the trade imbalance is once again the issue, and
Right.
it's a very, very hot issue. And Trump chose to address that with tariffs, and this was, there was a statement put out by the British House of Lords that really savagely went after Trump for these tariffs, and basically said that this was threatening to end the special relationship, and
Mm-hmm.
that Britain would have to start looking at ways to combat President Trump by reaching out to like-minded people within the United States. And so this was the basis of a lot of the British intelligence activity, the covert activity, and the British interference generally with the Trump administration. That, according to published statements by the House of Lords, it was Trump's specific efforts to adjust what he saw as a disadvantageous trade balance, especially with China.
Right.
That the British, for some reason, felt no, we have to keep the Americans pouring their money into China for whatever reason. I mean, we can examine that issue later. What do the British have? I mean, what is their stake in having us bleed all our money into China? Obviously, something. But it's very interesting, Tom, and I think very significant and telling that here we are more than 240 years later, and it's still the same issue. It's the issue of the mercantile system being imposed upon us in one form or another. The mercantile system being what I just described, where we are treated as a colony. We are not allowed to industrialize. We're only supposed to export foodstuffs and raw materials cheaply, and then we must import manufacturers from other countries. We're right back where we started, where our country has been deindustrialized, and we are now being returned to that pre-revolutionary state. It doesn't seem coincidental to me. It seems like the plan.
No, it's not. It's not coincidental at all. And that's and I think what I was getting at here is, and this ties into my arguments about the control over our monetary system is the means by which this was allowed to continue. Like, so, as we think about the 19th century in the relationship where the British are fighting American industrialization as an independent country by trying to maintain the trade imbalance, then we move ourselves up into the Civil War period, or the recent unpleasantness period, as we like to say it down here in the South. And you get into, then you find out that, well, it was the British and the French who, were backing Southern secession in order to combat the industrialized North. They had created a similar kind, and the North in the United States had created a similar system in the North and the South, the tariff of abomination, in order to keep the South from industrializing. And this was just these things were, I don't know. I can only suspect that. I wonder who was behind the tariff of abomination in the first place in order to set these things in motion. One of the things that's really interesting when you're talking about John Adams, and I was thinking about when I was thinking about how I was taught about all this stuff back then. In modern, even when we were children, I think we're over the same age. I'm 56. We were taught it was the beginning of the time when they started subverting the myth of the founding fathers as being anything other than slave owners and smugglers and all these disreputable people. Notice about John Hancock was a smuggler. Well, yeah, of course he was a smuggler. For laying it out the way you just laid it out, it made perfect sense that these would be the people that would be the people who that organized this, because it was intolerable for them to have to operate under these conditions. And so, but one man's smuggler is another man's freedom fighter. For one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That kind of redefining of terms, which, oh, by the way, is yet another example of how communists like to redefine terms to their advantage. But I digress. So when you tie this into central banking and their control over our banking system and everything else, think about the Panic of 1857. Panic of 1857 was the first transcontinental financial crisis in history that we know of, right? That we, at least as we can, trace the history of it. And in the Panic of 1857, President James Buchanan refused to take the side of the railroad banks. And those railroad banks that were going bust were all banks that had deep ties to Europe. They were the ones funding the build out of the railroads and the boondoggle that was the railroad boom of the 1840s and 1850s here in the United States. My understanding of Buchanan and how he handled the Panic of 1857 was to say, look, y'all, this is not my problem. This is not the United States government's problem. My job is to shore up the state banks to make sure that there's enough liquidity in specie, at that time would be liquidity, in the state banks in order for the local economies to continue operating. And that's what he did. And he refused to do anything to help the banks in New York and Ohio and their ties to continental Europe and let them figure it out for themselves. Now, isn't it interesting that Buchanan is then ostracized by his own party at the 1860 convention, so that we wind up with a newly formed GOP, an offshoot of the Whigs, with Abraham Lincoln, an Illinois railroad lawyer, representing railroad banks, and Stephen Douglas, an Illinois railroad banker for the Democrats, but no Buchanan. Buchanan refused to stop the South from seceding in one sense, but he was effectively punished for not bailing the banking system out during the Panic of 1857, and the revenge is taken at 1860 in order to get us to the moment where there would be a quote unquote civil war. Because no matter who lost that election, the banks won. Mm-hmm. That's the Tom DiLorenzo version of who wrote the book The Real Lincoln, and attached to the Mises Institute wrote. That's his thesis or his take on what happened surrounding the Panic of 1857, the election of Lincoln, and all the rest of it. Now, those guys over in Auburn, Alabama, at the Mises Institute are all very much anti-Lincoln because they're thinking about it from an individualist ideology perspective. But at the same time, when you layer onto this the British and French backing of the South secession, the whole thing and the whole surrounding of the Civil War, the milieu of it, takes on a completely different meaning. And I know in the last year or two, I've really come to challenge my own perspectives on what I thought about the Civil War. For years, I used to just say Lincoln was a tyrant. Mm-hmm. If you don't like it, get out of Florida. You have no business, have no business living here. And I'm a transplanted New Yorker who lives in the South and has come to understand why the South, and philosophically, the South I still believe was right, but at the same time, they were being manipulated for geopolitical purposes into expressing their philosophy, their philosophical rightness in a way that would serve globalist interests. Is the way I've come to understand this and to rectify this position in my own head. So, and then that takes us into the Third American Revolution, because if the Second American Revolution is the Civil War, then the Third American Revolution is 1913, where we get the direct election of senators, we get the income tax, and the central bank, the Federal Reserve.
Well, I'd call that more of a counter-revolution.
Fair. Fair. I mean, I'm just thinking about it as these inflection points in American history, and so take it from there. Go for it.
Well, basically, the way I see it, and I agree with you, by the way, about the Panic of 1857, that this was really, in many ways, the trigger that caused the Civil War. But the gun, if you will, had already been very well primed before then. And the way I see it is that there were three wars of independence, and that was the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the American Civil War. And all three of these wars were fought in an effort, but they were instigated by the British, first of all, in an effort to impose or reimpose their mercantile trade relationship over the United States in one way or the other. And in the case of the Civil War, in some ways, it was their most successful and most dramatic imposition of that system, because the British actually succeeded in recolonizing the American South. They made the South, they reimposed a mercantile relationship whereby the South was exporting about 80% of its cotton to England, to the textile mills in England, and England was overwhelmingly its best and most important customer, um, without which they could not succeed. And so they were completely loyal to the British and the British agenda. They could not exist or survive without the British, and they fell quickly back into the colonial relationship with the mother country, where they were very content and very happy with exporting cotton to the mother country and then buying manufactured goods back from them. Both sides were very happy, but it came from a cost. It came at a cost, in my opinion, because what happened in the South is what happened in all colonial areas, where you had a very small group of people who got very rich, and these were the colonial elites. And in the South, they would be people like Scarlett O'Hara and her family. These are people who got fabulously wealthy by acting, by selling to the British. And but because the balance of trade was so lopsided in the favor of the mother country, as is necessarily the case in a colonial economy where raw goods go out, manufactured goods come in, the balance of trade will always be to the disadvantage of the colony. And so what happens, and really the only way colonies work, is that the mother country cultivates this colonial elite to be sympathetic to them by making them very rich and powerful, but everybody else is living at a very low level. And these would be the slaves and the poor whites down in the swamps, eking out a living however they may. And so you may not agree with this, Tom, but I would agree then with the claim by Henry Carey, who was Lincoln's top economic advisor. Carey wrote books and pamphlets where he expressly stated what I'm telling you now, that the South had become an economic colony of England, and that this was in fact the cause of slavery, because the British did not depend on the cotton growers of the American South the way the cotton growers depended on them. The British were constantly trying to develop other markets in other countries, and specifically in Brazil, in Egypt, in British India, and other areas. They were always trying to develop cotton growing areas, but they I don't think they ever succeeded in getting cotton of the quality they could get from the American South and at that price. But so the British were always keeping their Southern suppliers on edge as to whether their cotton was cheap enough. They were always trying to keep the price point down. And this is how, according to Carey, they were forced to use slavery in order to keep those costs where they felt they needed to be. And so this is a situation that you find universally in any colonial economy where you have this mercantile relationship. You have a very wealthy colonial elite, which has a firm stake in maintaining the colonial relationship, but then everybody else is living at a much lower level with very little opportunity, and maybe even slavery, as we had here. So Henry Carey was a very important figure. He was one of the really first American economists who had a world-class standing. He was known to Karl Marx. In fact, were leading uh, columnists for that newspaper of Horace Greeley, whose name I still can't remember.
It
Sorry.
was the New York Tribune. I looked it up while you were
Oh,
talking.
thank
Yeah,
you.
so it
The
was
New
the
York Tribune.
New York Tribune and Horace Tribune.
Right. And they were kind of friendly rivals. Henry Carey actually liked Marx. He admired him a lot, and he was always trying to be friendly with him. But Marx didn't like Carey at all for some reason, and probably because Carey was very pro-American, and he advocated what he called the American system, which was protectionist. He advocated imposing tariffs in order to prevent countries, especially England, from reimposing their mercantile relationship.
That makes sense.
Now, what the North wanted in this situation before the Civil War, they wanted to replace England as the South's leading trade partner. The North wanted to build cotton mills, textile mills, and trade with the South. The South had zero interest in doing that because they felt that the North did not have the capacity to buy all their cotton or to distribute it worldwide as it needed to be, because the quantities they were putting out needed worldwide distribution, and only the British could provide that. And this statement was made very clearly in a book called Cotton is King by a man named David Christie. And this became the manifesto of the Southern Confederacy. And Christie, he just laid it out. He said, we know what the North wants. They're putting up these tariffs to try to prevent us from trading with England, to make it prohibitively expensive, because they want to take England's place and have us sell our cotton to them and have them become the leading cotton textile producer in the world. But Christie said, we are not interested in doing that because they do not have the capacity, they do not have the capital to develop it. How many years would it take for them to do it? Will they ever succeed? We are happy doing business with the British Empire because they have everything in place that we need, and our future is with them.
Mm.
So if you read Christie's book, it's very, very clear that the war, the entire purpose of the war, was this contest to see who was going to be the leading trade partner of the South. Was it going to be the North, or was it going to be England? And that's why the North, the Union under Lincoln, and England came to blows, and they actually did come physically to blows, because when well, first of all, the British, through their secret agents, they were whipping up secessionist fervor in the South going back to the 1820s, and
Right.
they directly caused the economic crisis of 1857, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something Henry Carey accused them of. He said this was the British, setting a spark to the powder keg. And so the British were not only thoroughly involved in instigating the Southern Rebellion, but they were constantly making promises to the Southern leaders that if you secede, we will help you, we will protect you, you can rely on us. And I have some doubt as to whether the South ever would have resorted to arms if they hadn't had those reassurances from England, which in fact the British never made good on. What happened is, once hostilities broke out, the British kept telling the Southerners, well, yes, we're going to help you, but we need you to have a little more success on the battlefield so we can be assured that you're going to pull your weight. And sorry?
No, I was about to say, does this sound familiar?
Right, exactly. It's a never-ending process. And so now the British did help them in certain tangible ways, especially on the high seas. They basically built the Confederate Navy in England, launched the ships. Some of these very successful Confederate raiders, like the CSS Alabama, that sank more than 1,000 Union ships, and came very close to breaking the Union blockade. The Alabama had a British crew. Several of these ships had British crewmen actually on board fighting for the Confederacy. But the British also put troops in Canada, and they put 40, their French allies put 40,000 French troops in Mexico and did a coup against the Mexican government and installed a French puppet, the Emperor Maximilian, who was an Austrian duke, and the French put him in. So the British had men in Canada ready to go. The French had 40,000 men in Mexico ready to go. And they weren't planning to do a full-scale invasion of the United States and take it over by land. They didn't have to do that. What they were planning to do actually was to wait until the Confederates had achieved some sort of decisive victory on the battlefield. Then they were going to intervene, the French and the British. They were going to say to Lincoln, look, you're losing the war. Why don't you let us arbitrate a separation between North and South, and so we can end this terrible bloodshed? And they anticipated that Lincoln was going to say no, and that would have been the signal for a naval attack. They were then going to attack by sea and break the Union blockade, and that would have effectively ended the war, because that blockade was the primary weapon that the Union had against the South to stop them from trading.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was the Russians intervened.
Right.
Lincoln had been negotiating with the Russians for some time, and Tsar Alexander II, for his own reasons, he felt it was good to keep the British and the Americans at odds with each other. He and his diplomats felt that together these English-speaking countries would be a terrible threat to their interests and everyone else's. And so the best thing was to keep them fighting each other. And so the Russians had pursued that policy since the time of Catherine the Great, since the time of the American Revolution. Catherine had supported the rebels.
Mm-hmm.
So the Russians then intervened once again in the Civil War. And in 1863, in the fall, I believe, they sent the entire Russian fleet to North America, and half of it went to New York and the other half to San Francisco, and they docked there for several months. And by this means, they warned the French and the British that if they attempted hostilities against the Union fleet, they were going to come to blows with the Russian fleet, and then they would have war with Russia, which meant land war in Europe with Russia.
Right.
And there were a lot of complications in Europe having to do with Poland and Greece and other disputed areas where the British especially did not want to tangle with Russia on the ground in these contested areas in Europe. So in many ways, it was just, the war was decided, as was the revolution too, by much larger issues that went beyond what was happening in North America and what was happening between the great powers of Europe. And it easily could have exploded into a world war.
Right.
If Russia and England and France had all gone to war with each other, it would have been a global war, very much as the Revolutionary War turned out to be, with global military operations between Britain and France,
Right.
which a lot of people don't realize. So this almost happened in the Civil War as well, but it didn't, because the British and their French allies backed down in the face of this Russian fleet deployment, and that was probably the decisive act, the decisive move that turned the war completely in the North's favor. I mean, I believe they did it after the Battle of Gettysburg. So Gettysburg, of course, was a decisive battle because they turned back. The South had invaded Pennsylvania. They turned them back, but then the Russians came in. So that made it really decisive. So anyway, so the whole issue was, were we going to allow the British to colonize a huge part of our country? And that's from, at least from the northern point of view. And the answer was no. That was Lincoln's answer. And his economic advisor, Henry Carey, was a huge voice in Lincoln's ear who was constantly telling him, it's the British, it's the British, it's the British. You have to be wary of what they're up to because they're the ones who are behind this. Now, interestingly, you mentioned Thomas De Lorenzo's book, The Real Lincoln,
Hmm.
which I read when it first came out. And in fact, that's where I first read about Henry Carey. And he had a section in there about Henry Carey where he just really went after him, saying he was corrupt and he was for protectionism. That's so terrible. And, on all these libertarian grounds, he was for, Carey
Right.
represented industrial policy, big government and all that. And so being being a libertarian as I was at that time, and we talked about before,
Hmm.
I still insist on calling myself a libertarian, but I'm such a bad one now. I'm
Welcome to the club. I've been accused of this as well, of being a bad libertarian. Literally, like last week, it was hilarious. But it is interesting, and I remember reading that book. It's up on my shelf in my office, and I read it when it first came out as well. And at the time, that to me was revelatory about the Civil War,
Mhm.
and again, on those grounds, from that perspective, Lorenzo's not wrong if you're looking at it from that perspective, but there are bigger issues than that as well, along all, as we've just kind of gone over in a number of different ways. And so I find it really interesting then that I think is it fair to say, in your estimation, that the failure of the recent unpleasantness to reestablish the mercantilist, the splitting of the United States and the reestablishment of the mercantilist arrangement between the South, between the United States and England, that's in many ways kind of the turning point, in the beginnings of the turning point in the relationship, where the Brits look at the situation and go, okay, we can't take America over. We have to take them over from within. If we're going to take them over, we have to subvert them and persuade them to our side. So that here we are 40 or 50 years later, as the British Empire is in decline by the late 1890s and into the early 20th century. That the better way of doing this is not to export our mercantilist system, but to export our monetary and political system and foreign policy system, and graft that onto the United States and say, look, no, you can be our empire now, because we can't do it anymore. Is that a fair assessment of or a jumping off point for the next phase of this discussion? Or
Well, yes, I would agree to that with that up to a point. The
sure,
British absolutely were forced by force of arms by the outcome of the Civil War. They were forced to step back, reassess, and come up with another strategy. And that strategy played out finally under the administration of Woodrow Wilson, with, as you mentioned, the installation of the Federal Reserve System and drawing the U.S. into World War I and attempting to bring us into the League of Nations,
right.
and which eventually succeeded in the form of the United Nations um, in World War II. But yes, that was a new plan. The part where I would disagree is I don't believe it was motivated by the so-called decline of the British Empire. I don't believe the British Empire was in decline during the Victorian era when all this was happening. It wasn't a decline. It was simply a sober assessment by British elites, assessing their situation and thinking very far ahead, which is what they do, unlike us, and saying, where are we going to be 50 years from now? Where are we going to be 100 years from now? And how do we start preparing for that now? And you can see a number of books. There's one by a guy named Seeley called The Expansion of England, that was written in the early 1880s. And he lays out the whole plan for decolonization back in the 1880s, supposedly at the height of the Victorian era. And what he says is that the British Empire cannot be sustained in its present form, primarily because it's too far flung, because it's a maritime empire, a seaborne empire on many different continents, and yes, Britain had a powerful navy, so they could quickly bring force to bear anywhere on the high seas, where anywhere in their vast, far-flung colonial empire where it was needed. But the problem that Sealy and other British elites foresaw as they saw the rise of land-based empires such as the US and Russia and Germany, which were electing not to expand through overseas colonization, but to grow by land. And Sealy recognized that these empires were the future, and these empires would eventually uh, defeat the British Empire, because the British Empire was vulnerable. You could attack any of its colonies, and if you attacked enough of them at the same time, the Navy wouldn't be able to get enough troops to the right place. It was just too spread out, and it was not practical to defend it. And so this was already officially recognized, you might say, in the 1880s. They understood we cannot beat the United States in particular. And so they made a decision that they were going to beat Germany and they were going to beat Russia, but they were going to do so with the help of the United States. And this is where the plan came from, to draw the US back into some kind of reinvented British system and let the Americans be the ones who carry the weight of the military adventures, this military enforcement. And that's exactly what has happened.
Yes.
Today. That's exactly where it is. And I just wanted to draw your attention, Tom. I just put up on my Twitter account, my X account, a few days ago, I think it was on the 25th, Eric Prince made a surprising statement where he said, we need to colonize, we meaning the United States, we need to colonize Africa and all of Latin America. And I don't know if you caught that.
No, I didn't.
And well, he said that there's video, and so I just put the comment. I said, well, Eric Prince says we need to colonize Africa, and he says it as if it's his idea, but it's not. I said the British officially and publicly proposed this very idea in 2005, and I then attached the original article where this proposal was made. It was published in the Daily Mail in, I think, January of 2005. It was written by the British historian Andrew Roberts. I don't know if you're familiar with him, a very prominent British historian and propagandist, and one of the leaders of a movement that was then called the New Imperialism. And what he wrote in this article is that it's time for Great Britain to reclaim its colonies, especially in Africa. The headline of the story was Recolonize Africa. Just like that.
Just like that.
And what he said is, it's time for us to go in there, recolonize Africa, because look what a mess it is. These dictators are so corrupt. They treat their people horribly. We need to go back there and restore order and get everything running again. And less than 2 years later, in 2007, the United States of America dutifully, I would say, set up U.S. AFRICOM, the United States African Command, whose purpose was to oversee future U.S. operations in Africa, which had not and had never formerly been an area of U.S. military operation. This is something that people don't understand. Prior to this, prior to Andrew Roberts announcing the new imperialism, prior to him stating that all the English-speaking countries in the world are going to help us recolonize Africa, stating this with great confidence, and prior to the United States then dutifully, a couple years later, announcing we have now established U.S. AFRICOM because it's going to oversee some mysterious future military operations in Africa. Prior to that, the U.S. did not engage in military operations in Africa for a very simple reason. It was within the European zone of control,
right,
and was recognized as such. in the Treaty of Paris of 1951, which is considered the first in the series of treaties that created the EU, the 1951 Treaty of Paris created the common market. And I think there were 6 countries in it at that time. And I believe every single one of them was a former colonial power. Well, they were present colonial powers in 1951. They still had their empires. And in that treaty, it formally sets up a post-colonial or neo-colonial economic system whereby they were foreseeing decolonization, but they were also setting up and enshrining in an international treaty how the neo-colonial system would work, where basically all the colonial powers, Great Britain, France, Portugal, and the rest, those who had colonies, especially in Africa, but not, elsewhere as well. I think there was a special accommodation, though, for those in Africa. Africa was seen as a very special area for Europe. And all those countries which had at the time colonial possessions or were in the process of shedding them, all of those colonial areas were deemed to have a special relationship, quote unquote, with the common market and were granted certain trade concessions, terms of trade that would supposedly be mutually advantageous and so forth. So by that Treaty of Paris in 1951, the emerging, what we now know of as the EU, this emerging European Union was all what formalized and enshrined a neo-colonial relationship between Europe and Africa, enshrined in a binding international treaty. And that treaty and those commercial relationships, those neo-colonial relationships, were enforced by military action many, many times since between 1951 and now, especially by the French. Now, the Portuguese continued fighting full-scale colonial wars there until 1974, when the British overthrew their government through a color revolution called the Carnation Revolution. The British were leading this decolonization effort, and they wanted they announced that they were going to decolonize, but they wanted all the other colonial powers to follow suit under their direction. And the Portuguese said no. They wanted to keep the old system going. And so the British did a coup. It was called the Carnation Revolution. They overthrew the Portuguese regime, which was the successor. I forget the name of the president, but he was the successor of the dictator Salazar, who'd been in there since, I don't know, the 1920s or before. And so they overthrew him, the post-Salazar regime, and they put in a left-wing regime that was supposedly anti-colonial and all that. And then the British came in with their advisors and helped oversee the Portuguese dismantlement of their African empire in accordance with the British plan. So this was all part of the whole decolonization plan, which had already been foreseen by Seeley in his book, The Expansion of England, back in 1883, I think it was. This was the plan that had been made in the Victorian times, that England and its allies and its rivals would all somehow withdraw from their maritime overseas empires, and then Britain would bring in the United States to be the muscle to maintain a new kind of empire where they didn't have direct political control over these countries, but they still maintained the old mercantile colonial control, now called neo-colonial control. But what was unique in a way about Africa is that the U.S. did not go in there during these decades of the post-war era, the Cold War. The Europeans did it themselves, especially the French. The French intervened more than anyone else, and very effectively. When there was some government they didn't like, French paratroopers would go in, they'd knock them out. If anything was happening that they didn't like, the French would go in, and often the British too. The British did major military operations. You may remember they invaded Sierra Leone
Mm-hmm.
in 2000, and other operations like that. So this was an area that was absolutely deemed to be European colonial or neo-colonial territory, and the American military did not operate there, at least not overtly. But after Andrew Roberts declared the new imperialism in this 2005 article, and after the U.S. set up this U.S. AFRICOM, all of a sudden a new policy emerged, which is that the U.S. was basically announcing that they were planning to help the Europeans recolonize Africa in accordance with this plan. And now all of a sudden Eric Prince gets up after all these years and says, guess what? We are going to recolonize Africa. I think he even said recolonize it, but he forgot we never colonized it in the
Mm-hmm.
first place. We were never
Well,
there before.
and that's what's interesting about the recent events in places like Nigeria, and all the ECOWAS states and everything else. With the fact that the French are now on their back foot, losing control of a lot of these countries, and as they step up with oh, by the way, with Russian support and Chinese support, who are also heavily involved in Africa. So like so much of this is, as you've said at the outset of this, that history rhymes, and all of that. You can see the parallels to what's happening today, and so now the bigger question is the following: as we've seen in the past, the Russians were probably just as many, are reading the chessboard the same way that the Brits are and making counter moves there. So let's talk about a couple other things, then bring into this discussion, which is the Arabian Peninsula, Israel, political Zionism, which is a topic I tend to stay away from. But in terms of talking about this very thing that we're talking about today, why Israel? Why the Balfour Declaration? Why the formation of Israel? Yada yada yada. Like, it's very clear at a certain level that this is a British operation in order to get control of the maritime sea routes in the area, and Israel is their colony there. And the more I think about this, and I'm probably gonna be looked at as a heretic in many ways, but because there's too many people at this point, as you pointed out at the beginning, you wrote an article, which is actually the reason I had you on the show over the summer, when I read that article, which is how the British created communism and blamed it on the Jews. I say this: it's very clear that the British have a political and economic interest in this area of the world, grafting a kind of religious, Israeli, or sorry, but Jewish, for lack of a better term, eschatology onto their political operation, creates the what's the word I'm looking for? Creates that the conditions for why we have history of the 20th century leading the way it has. If you understand what I mean, you're in effect using Jewish religious imperatives to, as a in a sense, as the useful idiots for a British political and economic operation. Am I off base in framing it in those terms? It
No, no, not at
seems
all.
pretty obvious to me at this point, the way. And so this is part of the problem. As and as always, the useful idiot gets blamed for somebody else's policy.
Well, yes, to the extent I understand what you said, I think you're right. Basically, I I see. Well, quite frankly, given the scenario that I've laid out, where we now have a world governed by a globe spanning English speaking superstate, which includes the United States, but which I believe is still basically directed from London. I believe that. Some people disagree.
Right.
But given the overwhelming force of the English-speaking world, given the fact that this is now an English-speaking planet, and that the Anglosphere, or the English-speaking world of the Five Eyes countries, is indisputably the global hegemon collectively. Um, I don't think personally there's anything that goes on in any part of the planet that isn't part of their plans, the plans of this English-speaking superstate, first envisioned by the Round Table Group back at the turn of the century, the 20th century. Now, the very existence of the state of Israel, of course, uh, is directly due to British policy, that the British wanted to install a Jewish state in that region. Um, there's plenty of original source material, primary sources from British strategists who made it clear that their ideas that this Jewish state would somehow function as a satellite of Great Britain and would look after British interests in the area. At the same time, they were cultivating the Muslims in exactly the same way. And this is one of the kind of infamous aspects of this whole enterprise, which there are some videos about it that are circulating around social media. But basically, the British made contrary promises to the Jews and the Arabs, promising each other things that were incompatible in such a way that makes it seem pretty obvious that what they wanted was to have these two groups permanently at odds with each other, a strategy of tension,
Mm-hmm.
and which is what they got. And so you have a situation, I think, where both the Israelis and the Arabs are, in a sense, competing to see who is going to be the favorite of, let's say, Big Daddy, whoever Big Daddy is. And I insist that Big Daddy is still Great Britain, and that the U.S. is merely a military enforcer which has been incorporated into the British system. But of course, the narrative that's being pushed, and pushed very hard
Mm-hmm.
by official protected influencers on social media, is it's all the fault of the big bad United States,
Right.
which of course is controlled by the evil Zionists. And I personally think that whole idea, first, that the U.S. is somehow at fault for what's going on in the Middle East, and second, that the U.S. is controlled by Zionists. I think that's a British propaganda narrative, which serves a dual purpose of villainizing the U.S., shifting blame to the U.S., and then further shifting blame to the Jews. And
Mm-hmm.
it has remarkable similarities to what they did in Russia, uh, as described in my article.
No, no,
Where
please go into this. Because what's important here is not to say that, again, I'm not even I'm not even convinced of any of these positions. What I want to do here is to show a pattern of behavior. Okay, that this is a kind of thing that happens over and over again. Like as you were describing the Civil War here in the United States, the recent unpleasantness, the only phrase that kept coming through my head over and over again was color revolution. That it was yet
Mhm.
just another British color revolution. I see it, and you can see it everywhere. It's not to say that it always reduces to this. These are aspects of these stories that show up, and like this is the way these people operate. Whether they're wholly successful at that, that's up to the listener to decide. I don't care. What I want you to do is to question any of, and what I want everybody to do is to question the narratives that they have been presented. So yes, I would love to hear about how they set these people against each other inside Russia. And I presume you're going to be talking about the October Revolution.
Right. Well, as you know from my article, and just to remind your listeners, it was called "How the British Caused," or how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews.
Right.
It was a very long article.
Yes, it was.
I think it was 18,000 words long. Um, it covered a lot of ground, but it basically argued that the British had been doing color revolutions at least since the French Revolution, that the French Revolution was a British engineered color revolution whose purpose was to overthrow Louis XVI, a great enemy of Britain who had taken the side of the Americans during the American Revolution.
Right.
So the British hated him. They wanted him and his whole dynasty out. They wanted a new regime in which they could control. And so they fomented a color revolution, which we now know as the French Revolution. And they got rid of Louis XVI. Then they proceeded to do similar maneuvers all over Europe throughout the whole 19th century, the various revolutions of 1848, then finally the Russian Revolution, the first Russian, the Kerensky Revolution, sometimes called, but or the I guess officially they call it the February Revolution because under the old calendar it took place in February. But the first revolution where they overthrew the Tsar, and that was basically a palace coup that was done by disaffected and jealous members of the Russian royal family itself who were working directly with the British embassy to overthrow the Tsar. And I wrote about this in some detail in my article. And then the British seemingly and apparently, and they were accused of this by Kerensky in his book later. He said the Kerensky then took power somewhat later, and he said the British were constantly trying to undermine him. He knew they were out to get him, and that he was just an interim figure, and they were going to replace him with somebody else. And they were constantly causing provocations, military coups, causing other problems for the Kerensky government, including forcing the Kerensky to do an all-out offensive against the Austrians. They were still in World War I, an offensive that was totally doomed from the start, which had the predictable effect of utterly annihilating the Russian army and forcing them to surrender to the Central Powers, especially to Germany. And Kerensky accuses the British of having engineered all of this and of having raised up the Bolsheviks to replace him. And I think I did a pretty good job of showing that they did that the British were clearly, they were clearly behind the Bolsheviks after the Bolshevik coup, which was actually led and orchestrated by a British agent named Trotsky. Trotsky was a British agent. It's a little unclear when he was recruited. I was opting for the later dates simply to be sort of academically conservative. I was saying, well, maybe it happened during World War I sometime, but probably he was recruited much earlier. He was probably already working for the British during the 1905 revolution, but that's another story. But the thing is, there's also a lot of alternative history out there that says that Lenin was also a British agent, and he too had been recruited quite early in the early 1900s. I didn't say that in my article because my practice is always to try to rely as much as possible on respectable academic sources and primary sources, and to not to put stuff that's too speculative. So when I say that Trotsky was a British agent, I say that not speculatively, but that's solid academic scholarship. And you can see in the footnotes peer-reviewed academic papers on this very subject. So I fingered Trotsky as a British agent. I did not finger Lenin as a British agent, although that's alleged by a number of alternative researchers. I'm sure it's true, but until I can prove it from academic and primary sources, I'm not going to say it. Just a little explanation.
Fair enough.
But also, so you understand that when I say that Trotsky was a British agent, I'm not just making that up. I mean,
Right.
Look at the footnotes. So the thing is, Trotsky not personally led the coup on the night of the Bolshevik Revolution. And then shortly thereafter, he was made commander in chief of the Bolshevik armed forces by land and sea. And he was working for the British all along. So, and he did many things that were to their advantage, including through a proxy inviting the British to intervene militarily in the Russian Civil War. And this is where the British really showed their hands, because in the Russian Civil War, after the Bolshevik coup, the Bolsheviks really they had what was then called Petrograd, and they had a loose hold over Moscow. That's about all they had of the vast Russian Empire. They'd captured two major cities, but then they had the job of conquering this whole empire, which was heavily armed. There was a huge army which was under the control of the Tsarist commanders. And how are they going to manage that? Well, the British got involved, and basically the whole Russian Civil War was managed from London, from the British War Office, under the personal command of Winston Churchill. This was Churchill's personal project. And so what he did was I call it the Vietnam before Vietnam. It was a situation where somehow the communists won, but militarily it made no sense. They never stood a chance. They had two cities and a few surrounding towns, and they were completely surrounded by overwhelmingly superior forces of the so-called white Russians who were anti-communist. And somehow the British got in there and they got control of the white armies, and they were supplying them, they were funding them, and they just managed to misguide, misdirect, and mismanage the whole process deliberately in such a way that bit by bit, step by step, British agent Trotsky, who was the commander of the Red Forces, ended up winning. And then in the final phase, the British just abandoned whoever was left of their white armies and said, just leave the country. We can't support you anymore. No more weapons, no more money. And so the way the history books tell this, and especially the Soviet history books told it, was all the imperialist powers of the West converged on Russia to try to snuff out this uprising of the international proletariat, but they couldn't do it because the power of the proletariat in arms and in righteous outrage cannot be beaten by by the imperialists. But not, that's all a myth. The so-called imperialists weren't even trying to beat the Bolsheviks, and it's very clear. And I quoted extensively from Lloyd George, statements of the Prime Minister Lloyd George, who was PM at the time this was going on, and various of his men, that he made no bones about it. He favored the Bolsheviks. He wanted them to win. Winston Churchill allegedly, supposedly didn't, but he was never allowed to put forth his plans, to put his plans into effect. Um, Charitably towards Churchill, until proven otherwise, I'm assuming that's really true, that he really did want to beat the Bolsheviks, but his superiors did not. That's the one thing that's clear. They did not. So the British really showed their hands during those 5 years or so of the Russian Civil War, in which 8 million people are said to have died, all so needlessly, most of them civilians, through atrocities, disease, famine, and the like. And it was all with a predetermined outcome, because the British had been in command, they had been in control of the revolutionary process from the beginning. Two revolutions and a civil war, and it was always their intention, apparently, to have the Bolsheviks take over at the end.
Okay. So we now have Ukraine, and how do you think the story in Ukraine is playing out in much the same way? They've created a not Russia on the border of Russia, radicalizing brother against brother. It's a Russian civil war for all intents and purposes, with the goal ultimately of bleeding Russia white with the stated. Right? We have it from the Institute of the Study of War, run by Victoria Nuland's sister-in-law, and all the rest of it. That we still have the plan of carving Russia up into 7 different countries or 8 different countries or whatever it is. It's still, they published the map like last year.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, same process, but note, and they've radicalized the Baltics, they've radicalized the Poles, and they've radicalized the Ukrainians into, their, accentuating their, their anger at the Russians for their for how they were handled under Stalin and under the Soviet Union. And that's not to say that that any of these people don't have any right to hate Russians, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not at all. But to watch them then be radicalized into and have that used against them, and then we have to see this play out again, you know, uh, and it's all for the purpose of attempting to continue this process. Now, here's the thing that I find really fascinating, and you and I've talked about this before, and I brought it up, and I'm now trying to try and put all of this in the context of the United States, how the United States has been now demonized and propagandized into being this big, ugly empire that hell bent on maintaining its hegemony over the world and blah 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 blah. How the tiny British Isles could never still be in control of anything. But here's the thing, as my friend Alex Craner likes to say, all roads lead to London, and it's in effect. This is probably the name of this morning's podcast. When I think about, go back to what I was talking about earlier, and what we talked about at the beginning of this about British mercantilist system over the colonies, and the history of banking, and the history of and how the Federal Reserve and how effectively the central bank the process of the central bank in creating a monetary incentive feedback system for a mercantilist system where we send dollars out and we get manufactured goods. The United States in many ways sends dollars out and sends manufactured goods in. We don't have to produce them ourselves. We send them over to China. We send the money over to China to build the factories. We get the manufactured goods back, and then we wind up with no economy here at home. Now, I bring in what I've talked. I think what you and I talked about last summer, and what I continue to talk about all the time, which is the end of LIBOR, the London Interbank Offer Rate, which is the mechanism by which the price of dollars and the price that the Federal Reserve can set for the dollar, and how to get more dollars, was set by City of London, ultimately having control over the U.S. financial system, and then by extension the political system and everything else. We have now transitioned over to something called SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate, which is a domestic U.S. debt indexing rate that our mortgages, our credit cards, and our credit revolvers, and all the rest of it are now indexed to SOFR, which the British don't control. City of London does not control SOFR. The U.S. banks, as a matter of fact, U.S. regional commercial banks have more control over the debt indexing rate of the dollar and the value of the dollar and the cost of attaining new dollars than City of London does. Because in the past, I've explained this before, and I'm going to take the microphone for a couple of minutes to make sure that everybody understands, in the context of this, everything we've presented so far this morning, how that tail wags the dog. I've explained it before in many other podcasts and even in other articles and whatnot. I'm going to go through it now. Now that you understand now that we've established all this, now I'm going to explain it, why LIBOR was so important. Because here's the gig. We send dollars out. Those dollars wind up being deposited into banks all the way around the world. All around the world. Germany and London and Hong Kong, Singapore, Zurich, you name it, everywhere. That creates the opportunity for the people who have those dollars in account to become their own source of new dollar loans and new dollar wealth, meaning they can issue loans that the Federal Reserve has no control over, that's never gone through that's never gone through any of the structures that the Fed regulates. Fed is, in effect, as Jeff Snyder educated everybody on about 10 years ago, the Fed's not in control of its own monetary policy. The euro dollar system, the offshore dollar system, is in control of these dollars. Those dollars are indexed to LIBOR up until 2022. Meaning, if the London banks got into trouble, or if the offshore banks got into trouble, meaning they were short of dollars and they needed to get dollars, LIBOR would rise as the demand for dollars blew out, and the rate for LIBOR to borrow to go get those dollars on a temporary basis in overnight transactions would be quoted at LIBOR. LIBOR would blow out, and then in order to attract dollars. Now, what that does is then if all the debt in the United States is indexed to LIBOR, doesn't matter whether the bank in Palatka, Florida, or Des Moines, Iowa, that has all these loans out there, doesn't matter if they're in fine shape. Doesn't matter. All of a sudden, your HELOC, your credit cards, your company's credit revolver, which is indexed to LIBOR, rises accordingly. So if LIBOR goes from 2% to 6%, all of a sudden, your HELOC is now 4 or 5% higher. In effect, what that does is, regardless of the health of your balance sheet, regardless of whether your creditors are paying you 2% or 6% or anything else, all of a sudden, that money gets sucked out of the economy and causes. So when the rest of the world catches a cold, the United States catches a cold by extension over time. Okay? Because that's what's going to happen. You break the link between what's the offshore demand for dollars and the domestic demand for dollars, and all of a sudden, City of London is no longer effectively in control over the cost of dollars domestically in the United States. All of a sudden, you've broken the mercantilist link, because now it's not about goods per se. It's about the flow of dollars around the world, with the dollar being the global reserve currency. It's the same system. It's just been abstracted into the flow of currency around the world. Okay, which is effectively the same thing as before. We're not moving pounds of gold and silver around. We're moving pallets of digital dollars around. That is, in my estimation, the thing that happened under Trump that caused everybody to lose their minds, because that is the thing that removes the last snake from the U.S. garden. So the British still have control over the State Department. They still have control over the CIA. They still have control over the media. They still have control over various puppet politicians. They still have control over fiscal policy in the United States, because they have all their plants and all their people operating to serve the system. But they don't have control over the American banking system. It's akin to the day that Andrew Jackson killed the Second National Bank of the United States in 1836, and they hate him for it too, by the way, because it took away their ability to control the price of dollars as they flowed through the American economy. It's the thing that had to happen first before the United States could finally declare independence. I've been saying this for a while now, and I think everything we've presented today is designed for. This is my ulterior motive, was to have somebody else come in and explain the history of all this and the behavior of all to understand what I've been trying to say about the imposition or the creation of SOFR to get us off of LIBOR, to break that link. Because without that, every attempted American revolution has failed. It's stepwise cutting the cord from Mother Britain, from the time of Cornwallis to Henry Carey and Abraham Lincoln to Woodrow Wilson to today. And this is, I think, probably where our view of what's happening today diverges, Richard. And I don't mean this to be combative in any way, matter, shape, or form. I think it's important that we have this conversation, because I'm not sure I'm right about this. Okay. But again, it's like everything else. We present the information this way, to then put it into the context and then ask the question, oh, are they really still in control of everything? Well, yeah, because they're in control of all the systems and the institutions that have been built up. But are those institutions now have they reached their peak and inflection point, and now are we on the other side of it as the world starts to break apart? My friend Vince Lanci and I have been talking about the end of globalism and the return of mercantilism, but mercantilism in a form that is separate and unique and regional, so that the BRICS have their thing, America has their thing, and then what does everybody else do at that point? There comes a moment in time where the question is, if you have the right infrastructure in place, when the countervailing forces, when the next version of John Adams shows up and says, no, this is intolerable, we're not doing this anymore, or the Henry Carey, or whomever you want to, whatever historical figures have happened, iterations of these historical figures have happened in the past, we have them today. And in my mind, that guy is Jerome Powell, because Powell understands this link, which is why he's been doing what he's been doing and why we're still at 5.5% interest rates, even though at every iteration of this over the last 60 years, the Fed would have already pivoted and gone back to 2%. And they haven't done it yet. And he's not going to do it. And he's told you he's not going to do it. And so now the last thing we have left in all of this, and the reason I kind of brought up a little bit of Israeli or Jewish eschatology and all of this, is that there's an angle on this, a civilizational and religious angle on all of these groups being played off of each other by these evil fucking people over at GCHQ and 10 Downing Street. Okay, that there are forces arrayed against them that understand all this now, and they have actually the right tools with which to say, you know what, not this time. And that may be where we are right now. And I'm not saying we're there. I happen to believe we're closer. I happen to think we are trying it. I don't know if we're going to succeed, but that's what's going on. And that's why we're seeing the level of desperation that we're seeing from, Boris Johnson screaming about how Putin lied during the Tucker Carlson interview, or this or that. All these things that you're seeing out of these people, they're like running around like chickens with their heads cut off, screeching. And moreover, one last point on this. It is now fashionable all of a sudden to criticize Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Since October 7th, it's now fashionable to criticize Jews. Israel's engaging in genocide. The United States is going along with it. Blah, 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 blah. Oh my God, the Palestinians, who were, in many ways, they're made up people. But the one group I'm not allowed to criticize without getting unbelievable levels of pushback on from people who literally call me a Jewish apologist are the British. I started going on my rants about the British Empire and about the secret hand of Britain still controlling everything and all roads lead to London. And I get chapter and verse. And I'm going to tell you, I can predict right now when this podcast releases and it comes out, the comment thread on Twitter will be 50 to 60% bots telling everybody we're full of shit. And that you will hear this talking point. How can tiny little ridiculous England control the big bad United States? That's nonsense. By the way, folks, those are British bots. They may be AI, they may be Canadians, they may be Australians, they may be members of GCHQ, but they're all bots. They're all operatives. I have those people within my Patreon service at this point. I can see them. They're everywhere. And I get 10 times the amount of pushback about Britain still controlling American policy than I get about any other subject I talk about, which is why I wanted to have you on this podcast at this moment in time, because we are at a near inflection point in geopolitical events right now where all of these things are coming together. We are weeks away from the Russian elections. We are 2 months away, or 2.5 months away, from the day when President Zelensky of Ukraine, there will be a serious discussion, a constitutional discussion, as to whether he can stay in power after his term ends, even though he's declared martial law and suspended elections. And clearly, Zelensky is a British asset, because who built the Ukrainian army? It wasn't the United States. It was Canada and Britain were the ones sending most of the stuff in during the ceasefire from 2014 to 2022. That's who trained the Ukrainian army. It was British advisors, Canadian advisors, Australian advisors. It wasn't American advisors. Oh, we sent the weapons in through the back door, but they were building the army. So, because we have the money, they don't have the money. So this is my soapbox for this portion of the podcast. So I think it's I I I I want people to reframe what they think they believe. I may be full of shit here. I mean, I may be completely full of shit. You may be completely full of shit. Doesn't matter. What matters is that we actually question all of these things. Go, as you say, go to the primary sources, and make your arguments, okay? And run the incentive structure. And ask yourself questions like, why did Lenin create the modern borders of Ukraine? Why did he do that? Why did he create Ukraine the way he did? The modern version of Ukraine, from the borders, from the Donbass to Lvov, is a complete fiction. I'm not saying that Ukraine is a fiction or that Ukrainians aren't, culturally and aren't different people, and that there isn't a Ukraine in the world. It's just not the current borders of Ukraine, pre or post Russian invasion. That's nonsensical. Part of it's Hungarian, part of it's Polish, part of it's Romanian, part of it's Russian, and some of it is Ukrainian. And that is a classic British propaganda process. That is a classic, reframing of history in a way, and of reframing a conflict, and in such a way that it's one, ahistorical, and two, illogical. So then you have to ask yourself these questions as to why. That's why we had that. That's why we had to have this discussion today. And I just, will relinquish the mic. You can go from there, but I needed to do this one right here at this moment in the podcast. So I don't know where we go from here, but
well, I would say, first of all, I certainly hope you're right about Powell and the situation with the dollar and LIBOR versus SOFR and all that. I hope you're right. I don't have the expertise to even speculate on whether you're right on those particular issues. But regarding the other things you said, if I'm more pessimistic than you are, and I guess that's what you meant when you said we may diverge here, I don't think I'm ultimately pessimistic, but I tend to be kind of skeptical of optimism. I guess then maybe that makes me a pessimist.
That's a perfectly fair place to be. I mean, and again, I'm to say, and for the people who are with you on that side of the fence and listening to this podcast, you have every right to feel that way, folks. Because it makes sense. It's an easy position to be in. It's actually hard to be in the position that I'm in.
Well, I have a specific reason for being, I don't want to say pessimistic in the long run, because I do believe that America has a special destiny. Allow me to get a little mystical here. I believe we have a special destiny and a place to play in the evolution of the human race. I mean, I'm one of those American exceptionalists, and I believe there's a spiritual dimension to our country, and a special fate that awaits us, and a special purpose for us. So in the long run, I think all of that is going to play out in some mysterious fashion, which I think it would be folly to try to imagine in physical terms. So I do have that fate ultimately. One could say that I believe God is on our side. I mean, if you want to put it that way, I'm good with that. At the same time, I know enough about the history of the British imperial elites, let's call them, as opposed to the British people, two different things entirely. I know enough about them to know that they are almost infinitely flexible, and they play every side of every conflict, not just both sides, because there's never just two sides. They play every side of every conflict, one way or the other. They never go into any conflict assuming that one side is going to win and that's the side they're going to back. That is not the British way. The reason they win, the reason I would say they always win or always have up till now, is precisely because almost uniquely they just play every which side against the middle, and they are experts at going from one leader to another and whispering sweet nothings in their ear, whatever they want to hear, and just playing different groups off against each other. And so this, of course, applies to the Ukraine versus Russia thing right now. It applies to the Middle East, obviously. But look at our own Declaration of Independence. You want to talk about a primary document? One of the chief complaints that Thomas Jefferson wrote in that document is that the British Crown was inciting the Indian tribes on the frontier to attack the settlers, and doing so in very cruel manners, a very cruel manner, um, in disregard of the laws of war. And that was indeed happening. That was also a big issue in the War of 1812. And so the British were always playing off the Indian tribes against the white settlers, and feeling absolutely no hesitation or compunction about doing it. We often like to think of the British. They're often portrayed, especially when talking about this Round Table group in Cecil Rhodes. They're deemed to be Germanic or Anglo-Saxon nationalists who believed in white supremacy. But in actual practice, uh, I see no sign of any kind of racial loyalty amongst these elites. They don't hesitate to play off whites against non-whites in every which way possible. And we see this in our own history, dating back to the Revolution. This was one of the primary complaints, was that the British were stirring up the Indian tribes against the settlers on the frontier, and they were preventing settlers from moving west. And that was because the British had made certain treaties with those Indian tribes after the defeat of the French in the Indian War. And the British were actually serious about enforcing those treaties. And the Americans weren't. They didn't. They were highly motivated to disregard them. So in that respect, if we want to take a kind of dances with wolves view of the whole thing, the British, you could say, were in the right. They were sticking up for the Indians. They were keeping their treaties. But this was one of the causes of the revolution that was clearly outlined in the Declaration of Independence. And it to the British, it's not so much that they were trying to be fair or that they were trying to help the poor Indians. Of course, they couldn't have cared less about the Indians or anybody else. But they saw the power, or they saw two ethnic groups, two races of people who could be played off against each other. It's just as simple as that. And there's an interesting story uh, about Queen Victoria that when the Wild West show went to London, and Queen Victoria watched it, and of course in that show, Sitting Bull himself was the big star, where they would do a reenactment of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Sitting Bull himself would ride in as the victor, reenacting his defeat of Custer. So it is said, it's been written, that Queen Victoria kind of sidled up to Sitting Bull after the show and said, "Oh, we would, if you were, if we controlled your land, we would never make you perform in a show. We would never humiliate you this way." And it's not recorded to my knowledge what Sitting Bull said in return, but it's my understanding that he was very pleased and proud to be in the Wild West show. So I'm not sure how he understood what Queen Victoria was saying to him. But that's typical of what they do. You know, this game of sidling up to people and whispering in their ear, "Oh, if you were with us, we wouldn't let those Americans treat you this way." That's what they do, and that's what they do in every part of the world and in every country. And every country has some kind of situation of ethnic or racial tension or conflict. All you have to do is study it long enough and figure out where the fault lines are and then exploit them. And every conflict in our world today, I believe, if you look at it closely enough, you can see the handiwork of British psychological warfare operators doing exactly that, studying the ethnic fault lines, studying the religious fault lines, and exploiting them ruthlessly.
Well, and I will add to that by saying the following, as you were talking about it, I'm like, well, why would they be this way? It would be this way because these are people, again, to the point that the common criticism is, well, how is this tiny little island, going to control the world? Well, they don't have anything else. You have to fight. When you have nothing inherently, you have to fight with the weapons you have at your disposal. You don't
Hmm.
have a great industrial base. You don't have $75 trillion worth of, wealth in the ground in the form of oil and natural gas and gold and silver and titanium and aluminum like the Russians do. You don't have, vast herds of, vast forests of timber and everything. You don't have any of that. So you have to develop tools of warfare and tools of civilizational advance that are that consistent with what you have available to you. So you have to become masters of the sea and masters of subterfuge. You would have to become the masters of diplomacy and these things. And they've had hundreds of years as a group of people to hone these skills. As you were speaking, I say to myself, it just looks like a big game of diplomacy to me. There's a classic game, board game called Diplomacy. It was put out by Avalon Hill back in the 50s. Still in print today. You can still play it, and it's a game of basically World War One. And everybody takes a country and they fight out amongst themselves. And diplomacy, amongst board gamers, we don't play it anymore. Oh, the old goats of old original gangsters of role playing of a board gaming don't play it anymore. You know why? Because we like being friends with each other in our old age. Because games of diplomacy, I have literally been in the room of watching friendships end over
Hmm.
the stabbing that go on during a game of diplomacy. Because that's what the game is. The game that's on the board is nothing. It's the game out in the room that matters. It's the you and I in the back room, making a deal to carve up France, and then we do this, and then we back out of that deal at the last moment. But literally, and you watch people do this in a 6 or 7 player game, and you're like, by the time you're done, you're like, you find out things about your friends that you never thought you'd ever find out about them.
Hmm.
Because all of a sudden, like everybody's, Emperor Palpatine comes out, and they're all backstabbing each other and treating each other like cattle. And like, and there are no alliances in geopolitics. There is no morality here. There are only interests, right? Famously. Well, we have to analyze the world that way. And there are masters of it out there. I'm not saying the British are the only ones, but they play the game very, very well. And what's interesting is when they run up against somebody who can also play the game that well, that's when they really lose their mind. And I have news for you. Over and over and over again, over the last couple hundred years, it's been the Russians that have outplayed them and stopped, and in many ways, at least slowed them down. We keep coming back to this over and over and over again, and throughout this entire conversation. And I believe that Putin is one of those people that understands how to fight them because he's the only one in the modern era that has successfully defended against the British color revolutionary technique. He's done it 5 or 6 times in the last 10 years. Now, famously, he wasn't able to stop Ukraine, but Ukraine was a very special case where we threw unbelievable resources at. But you look at some of the other ones, and and he's going to wind up winning Ukraine. He's going to wind up winning Ukraine, I think, through political decapitation in Kiev, not on the battlefield. The battlefield is going to push the pressure such a way that we wind up with. We've already seen the cracks of it. We saw Zelensky was ready to fire Zaluzhny, the head of the armed forces, a few weeks ago. Victoria Nuland, British agent herself, high priestess of neoconservatism, Trotskyism, goes to Kiev and tells Zelensky, don't fire Zaluzhny. She leaves. He fires her anyway. He fires him anyway. Because the pressures that are happening within the cauldron of what's going on in Kiev right now are spiraling out of control. And so it's going to be very interesting. This might wind up being this may be their last stand. And I'm not saying it is, but I think it's very instructive for us to watch this play out this way. They have backup plans in other areas of the world, without a doubt. And one of their backup plans is, of course, to destroy the reputation of the United States. And they're doing so assiduously at the same time. So I think these are the kinds of counter move, things that are happening on the game board. Okay. That's the way I see it. So I really, so I'm not optimistic, and I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. What I am is I'm trying to be realistic, and I'm trying to assess things within the context of all these things that we've talked about. And, as a master gamer of this level of playing people off of each other, ask my friends how evil I am at the gaming table, because I am viciously horrible. My wife will tell you this. I see these moves. I can see this stuff coming a mile away because, well, I've done it. I've got 10,000 hours I've got my Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours of playing people off of each other. I spent most of my 20s and 30s doing this. My misspent youth was spent doing this. And I'm, again, not busting my hand, patting myself on the back, but when you trained yourself to do this kind of stuff, you're like, oh, that's what's going on. All right, well, let's see if there's anybody at the table that actually knows how to play this game. They're masters at what I would call board state balance. They keep the board balanced, and then they unbalance it in their direction. And they're very, very good at it. And they're very good at doing multivariate analysis in that respect, of balancing multiple players at the table to get them all questioning the other one's motivations. They're very good at it. They're masters at it. It's their superpower. They are. They're very good at it. So we'll see. We'll see if we're now so far down the generations with them that they're now the grandkids that are, that have spoiled. They're going to spend all the wealth that the grandfather created, right? That kind of thing, the generational wealth thing. We'll see if that's where we are. Because I'm watching the people that are running Britain today, and I'm like, you guys aren't nearly as good as you think you are. And that may be where we are, and that we've been conditioned because of the history of this to think that they're still really, really good at it, when really they may not be. And that maybe at the end of the day, they finally trained enough other players at the table to be good at this as well. And that we've now got a very interesting game board that honestly, we've never seen before. Because the stakes are very high now, Richard. It's now nuclear brinksmanship. It's not, we're not just moving armies around in, Eastern Ukraine. It's now nuclear brinksmanship. It's not the end of humanity, as we know it. So
I can only stand in awe of your optimism, Tom.
I think that happens every time you and I speak. I think you end with that every time. And again, it's not optimism. I think it's just reading the board. I think it may not be as bad as we think it is. I could be wrong. And if so, well, I have plenty of cigars in the humidor. Is that good? I think why don't we end it there? Tell everybody where you can find your work and what you do and all of that, and then we'll pledge to meet again and chat it, update this story again in, I don't know, 3 or 4 months.
Well, you can find my latest articles on Substack, and on the X platform, you can find me at Real Richard Poe. Okay, all right. And my books are on Amazon. Sorry.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure that there are links in the podcast description and all of that, because Richard's work is superlative, even if you don't agree with it. And that's the important part. If you don't agree with it, that's even better. You should read it twice. So, all right,
Thank
sir. Thank you very much for a stimulating afternoon, and we'll talk again soon. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that'll about wrap it up for episode 172 of the Gold Goats and Guns podcast. And I really want to thank Richard Poe for taking so much time to go through so many of these issues. And at some point, I almost do feel like I need to apologize for the 18 minutes I think I went off on, where I hogged the mic to kind of try and tie a bow around all these issues, because it ties into so many things that I try to communicate not only on this podcast, but on my writing and on my Patreon and the interviews that I do. And I think it's an important framing of this entire moment in history, because his moment in history is so very, very, very important. Like, we've got people out there literally wanting to start World War III, and I think this gives us a lot of context as to why. So with that said, I'm out. And if you like what you heard today, as always, you can follow me on my blog over at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. And you can sign up for and support the work through Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can get just the twice weekly market reports, or you can go whole hog and get the Gold Goats and Guns investment newsletter, monthly newsletter, which tries to tie all this up into a coherent portfolio strategy to help you navigate this incredibly dangerous period of history. So with that said, I'm gone. You guys be well. You take care. We will talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.